The rich man lifted a thick folder from his desk and slapped it against the marble surface with a grin. "Here," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "This is your contract." He flipped through the pages, each one filled with dense writing, paragraphs of rules, terms, and obligations. The papers seemed endless. Then he leaned closer, his eyes narrowing with mockery. "But you can't read this, can you?" His laughter echoed in the vast hall. It was not the laughter of joy, but of superiority. The sound bounced off the walls like a cruel echo, a reminder of the gulf between the powerful and the powerless. The maid did not flinch. Her gaze remained calm, her lips pressed together, her silence unbroken. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like she hadn't understood his words, or perhaps that she dared not answer. But silence carries power, a power he could not yet see. The man leaned back in his chair, waving a dismissive hand. "You sign what I tell you to sign. That is how this works. Do you understand?" Still, the maid said nothing. She lowered her eyes slightly, not in weakness, but in restraint. It was a look that spoke of patience, of someone weighing the moment, waiting for the right time to move. The rich man smirked again, convinced of his own victory. To him, the silence was proof of ignorance. To him, her stillness was weakness. He could not imagine that behind those quiet eyes, a storm was already gathering. The contract lay between them, a symbol of chains disguised as paper. Each page represented control, dominance, and humiliation, and he was certain she could never challenge it. But the audience, the invisible watchers of this unfolding story, can already feel it. Something is wrong. Something is about to shift. The calm in the maid's face is not the calm of surrender, but the calm of someone who sees further than her captor. The man's laughter faded into a smug smile as he tapped the folder once more. "Tomorrow you will sign. Tonight you think about your place. This is my house, my rules, and you are nothing but a maid." The maid lifted her gaze for the first time, just for a moment, and in that moment the air seemed to change. Her eyes met his with a quiet fire, so brief he almost missed it. But deep inside, something stirred. Something that told him, though he would never admit it, that he may have underestimated her. The marble hall fell silent. The contract remained untouched, and between them, unspoken, hung a tension that promised this was only the beginning. For silence, when chosen, is never weakness. It is preparation. And as night settled over the mansion, the stage was set, not for obedience, but for revelation. The contract waits to be read, and the next chapter will reveal whether silence can truly become power. Silence can speak louder than words, and as the rich man's laughter faded into the marble halls, the maid stood still, her face unreadable, her body calm, her mind alive with memories she carried like scars. Behind her, silence lived a story few could ever imagine. She remembered the dusty road of her childhood village, where books were treasures, and every page was a door to freedom. She remembered sitting under a flickering lantern, reading aloud to her younger siblings while her mother whispered, "Knowledge will be your armor, my daughter. Don't ever let anyone strip it away." But life was not merciful. The village gave her dreams, yet the world gave her trials. She had worked as a teacher once, her voice guiding children through the alphabets of hope. Then came the storms, poverty, loss, and betrayal. A collapse of opportunity forced her into servitude, a role that stripped her of titles, but never of dignity. Now, standing in that golden mansion, she carried all those, the years inside her chest. She had faced hunger, humiliation, and loneliness. Yet through it all, she had made a vow. Never again would she allow another person to decide her worth. The master of the house did not see this. He saw only her uniform, her dark skin, her bowed head. To him she was silence itself, mute, powerless, obedient. But she was listening, always listening. She listened to the way his voice rose with arrogance, how every word dripped with the assumption of superiority. She listened to the rustle of the contract pages, each one filled with traps disguised as rules. She listened to his guests chuckle quietly at his cruel jokes, eager to laugh at someone else's expense. And in her stillness, she gathered strength. He leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Do you hear me, woman? In this house, silence is obedience, and obedience is the only language I accept." The maid lowered her eyes slightly. But deep within, her thoughts were a storm. She thought of the countless women who had been silenced before her, of the chains hidden in words, of the cruelty disguised as law. And she thought of her promise, to never bow to humiliation again. Her silence was not submission, it was strategy. Every insult he spoke, she stored away. Every arrogant smirk she remembered. Every clause he waved at her like a whip, she studied without showing it. What the master failed to see was that silence gave her power he could not measure. While he wasted words on mockery, she sharpened her mind in the quiet. While he underestimated her, she prepared. And so, in that moment, a battle began. Not with shouts or defiance, but with listening. The audience watching her story already senses it. Something is hidden in her silence, something the rich man cannot imagine. Behind her lowered gaze lives a woman who has read every cruel line life has thrown at her, and survived. Her silence is a shield. Her memory is a weapon. And soon she will wield both. The contract still rests on the desk, heavy with secrets. The master believes he holds all the power, but he has no idea that the maid who listens is about to become the maid who speaks. And when she does, the entire house will tremble. The grand hall was alive with music, chatter, and the clinking of crystal glasses. Guests dressed in silk and gold filled the space, their laughter echoing beneath the towering chandeliers. Wealth dripped from every corner of the room, rare paintings, carved pillars, imported carpets. It was not a home but a throne, and tonight the rich man sat proudly upon it. At his side lay the thick contract, the same one he had tossed before the maid hours earlier. But tonight he was not satisfied with keeping the insult private. No, he wanted an audience. With a booming laugh, he rose from his velvet chair and raised the folder high. "Do you see this?" he called out, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This is the contract for my new maid. Thick as a book, filled with rules, and not a single word she understands." The guests chuckled politely, though some glanced at the woman standing quietly at the edge of the hall. She was in uniform, head slightly bowed, hands folded neatly before her. The very picture of obedience, or so it seemed. The man strutted across the marble floor, his sandals clicking sharply with every step. He stopped before her and waved the papers in her face, grinning as though he were putting on a performance. "Tell me, maid, how many letters can you even recognize? Do you know what this says? Or is it just meaningless ink to you?" His friends burst into laughter, their jeweled hands clapping, their voices rising in mocking agreement. The hall echoed with cruel amusement, every laugh a dagger meant to pierce her dignity. But she did not move. Her hands remained steady, her gaze lowered, her silence unbroken. The man leaned closer, lowering his voice so only a few near him could hear. "You should thank me," he whispered harshly. "Without this house, without me, you would still be crawling in the dust of poverty. So smile when I laugh, because I am your salvation." He straightened again, throwing his arms wide for his guests. "Look at her! A woman who owes me everything, yet cannot even read her own fate!" The hall roared again with laughter. Champagne glasses sparkled, fans fluttered, and whispers of mockery filled the air. To the crowd it was entertainment. To him it was triumph. But the camera, our unseen eye, did not linger on his grin. It drifted instead to the maid's hands. Still, calm, resting lightly against one another. No tremor, no sign of shame, only patience. A faint shift crossed her expression, so subtle most would miss it. Her lips pressed together, not in fear but in restraint. Her silence was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of someone who knew more than she was letting on. And in that moment, as the rich man's voice rose louder, as his guests laughed harder, the hall became a theatre. He was the actor, performing his arrogance. She was the audience, waiting for the final act. The laughter carried on, but beneath it all, there was a quiet tension building, unseen by those blinded by wealth, a tension that hinted this game of mockery would not last forever. For when silence breaks, it does not whisper, it roars. And soon, in this very hall, the first word would fall from her lips, and nothing would ever be the same again. The laughter in the hall had not yet faded when the maid finally lifted her head. Her eyes, calm and unshaken, met the blinding pride of the man who mocked her. For a moment, silence stretched across the room, thick enough to silence even the boldest chuckle. Then, without warning, she spoke. Her voice was steady, low, but unmistakably clear. "Clause 1, she read, her tone carrying across the marble walls. "The maid must surrender all personal freedom during hours of service, including the right to rest or speak without permission." The sound of her words hit the hall like a stone thrown into still water. Ripples of shock spread in. Stantly. Guests turned, their eyes widening. A few gasped aloud. The man's grin faltered. His fingers twitched around the contract, as though he had just lost his grip on a weapon he thought was his alone. The maid continued, unhurried. Clause 2. The employer reserves the right to withhold payment, dismiss without notice, and impose punishment should the maid fail to meet expectations. The crowd shifted uneasily. Whispers rose in the corners of the hall. This was no longer entertainment, it was exposure. The man barked out a forced laugh, waving his hand. "She memorized a line, that's all. A trick to impress you." But she ignored him. She turned the page, her fingers moving with practiced familiarity, her eyes scanning quickly before her voice rang out again. Clause 3. The maid forfeits the right to leave the premises without permission. She is bound to the household as property for the duration of employment. A chill ran through the hall. The arrogance of the contract was now laid bare. Each word, once hidden, now rang like chains clattering onto the marble floor. The maid's voice did not shake. She read with a calm precision that left no doubt. This was not memorization. This was understanding. Clause 4, she continued. Any disobedience will result in deductions, confinement, or public humiliation at the employer's discretion. Gasps turned into murmurs. The guests, once laughing, now exchanged uneasy glances. Some shifted in their seats, their champagne untouched. The man's jaw tightened. His smirk was gone, replaced by a twitch of anger. "Enough," he hissed, stepping closer. "You will stop this nonsense right now." But she did not stop. Her voice grew firmer, louder, commanding the hall with every syllable. Clause 5. The employer is exempt from accountability. The maid has no right to challenge or appeal any action taken against her. The final words hung heavy in the air. A silence fell deeper than before, broken only by the sound of her steady breathing. All eyes were now on her. Not the rich man, not the chandeliers, not the golden hall. Only her. The maid, who moments ago was nothing more than background, now stood as the center of the story. And with every word, the balance of power shifted. The rich man's smile had vanished completely. His hand, once waving with confidence, now trembled ever so slightly. His guests, the very people he sought to impress, now looked at him with something closer to disgust than admiration. The maid closed the folder gently, her fingers lingering on the cover. She lifted her gaze, calm and unyielding. "You thought I could not read," she said softly, but her words carried the weight of thunder. "But I have read every line, and now, so has everyone else." The hall was silent, utterly silent. The sound of her voice seemed to echo long after she finished, pressing against the walls, against their hearts, against the man's fragile pride. For the first time, the laughter had stopped, and in its place grew something new: fear. But this was only the beginning. The words had been spoken, the silence broken, and what came next would unravel more than just a contract. The air in the hall was thick. The laughter that once danced between crystal glasses had died, leaving behind a silence so heavy it pressed on every guest's chest. All eyes were fixed on the maid, who stood calmly with the contract in her hands, her voice steady as she turned to the next page. Her words sliced through the silence. Clause 6. The maid shall eat only after all others have finished. Leftovers may be provided, though not guaranteed. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Forks lowered onto plates. A lady in a jeweled gown covered her mouth with gloved fingers, whispering to the man beside her. The arrogance of the rule was undeniable, but the maid did not pause. She flipped another page, her eyes scanning quickly, before speaking again. Clause 7. The maid shall not speak unless directly spoken to. Any attempt at unsolicited speech will be deemed insolence. Gasps rose this time, not from her, but from the audience around her. They were no longer laughing. They were listening. The rich man shifted uncomfortably, his forced smile straining at the edges. "These are formalities," he stammered. "Legal jargon. Nothing unusual." But she ignored him. Her voice grew stronger. Clause 8. The maid is forbidden from contact with the outside world. No letters, no visitors, no freedom beyond the walls of this house. The words echoed like a verdict, each one pulling away the curtains that hid his cruelty. The guests leaned in, their earlier amusement now twisted into unease. The maid's eyes moved down the page. Clause 9. Should the maid attempt to leave without permission, she shall forfeit all pay and be blacklisted from future employment. The man snapped suddenly, his voice loud and sharp. "Enough! You have read enough." But her eyes didn't lift, her hands didn't shake, her voice didn't stop. Clause 10, she continued. The employer retains the right to impose tasks outside of contract scope without additional payment. Refusal will be considered breach of agreement. The hall erupted, not in laughter, but in whispers of shock and disbelief. Guests exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others staring openly at the master of the house with disgust. The maid turned another page. The rustle of paper was louder now than the man's protests. Clause 11. The maid shall at all times refer to the employer with titles of respect, including but not limited to Master and Lord. Failure to comply may result in penalty. Her words cut deeper than any insult could. The hall was no longer his, it was hers. The man's face flushed red. He stepped forward, hand raised, as if to snatch the contract from her fingers, but a guest's voice cut in from the side. Let her finish. The man froze. He looked around and realized the crowd, his own audience, was no longer amused by him. They were demanding the truth. The maid lowered her eyes once more to the page. Her tone softened, but the weight of her words only grew heavier. Clause 12. The maid may not look the employer directly in the eyes without permission. Repeated offences will lead to punishment. A wave of disgust rippled through the guests. Someone muttered, "Shameful." Another whispered, "This is slavery, not service." The rich man's breath grew ragged. He tried to laugh, but no sound came out. The room was no longer on his side. The maid closed the folder halfway, then paused. She let the silence stretch, drawing every ear, every heart closer to her next words. Then she spoke again. "And the final clause I will read tonight, Clause 13. The maid shall remember she is nothing. Her worth begins and ends with her service." The words struck like thunder. A woman gasped. A glass shattered against the marble as someone dropped it in shock. The maid finally looked up. Her eyes swept the hall, meeting gaze after gaze. "These are not the words of an agreement," she said softly. "These are chains. Chains written in ink, meant to bind dignity, to strip away humanity." The silence that followed was unbearable. Not a single guest dared to move. All that remained was the echo of truth, and the sight of the master, stripped of his pride before his own court. The maid closed the folder fully, her hand steady, her voice unwavering. "You asked if I could read," she whispered. "Now the world knows what I have read." The hall had turned against him. His power had cracked, his mask of arrogance slipping with every passing second. And yet, this was only the unravelling. The storm was far from over, for the next chapter would reveal not just hidden clauses, but the shifting of power itself. If power does not disappear in an instant, it seeps away slowly, like sand slipping through clenched fists. And in that hall of marble and gold, the guests could feel it. The master of the house, once untouchable, was losing his grip. Whispers broke the silence first, soft and uncertain. A woman leaned toward her husband, murmuring, "Did you hear those clauses? That is not employment. It is slavery." Another man shook his head, his voice firm enough for others to hear. "Unacceptable. Even animals are treated better." The words spread like sparks through dry grass. Soon the hall buzzed with murmurs, each one carrying judgment, each one weighing heavier on the shoulders of the man at the center. He stood rigid, his face tight, his pride cracking like glass under pressure. For years these guests had bowed to him, envied him, laughed at his jokes, admired his wealth. But now, their eyes no longer sparkled with admiration. They narrowed with suspicion, even contempt. The maid, still clutching the contract, did not move. She didn't need to. The room itself was moving around her, shifting in her favor. For the first time, she was no longer invisible. The master barked out, trying to reclaim control. "Do not listen to her. She twists words. She reads with malice. These are simple contracts, nothing more." But even as he spoke, he could hear it. The weakness in his voice, the tone of a man defending, not commanding. A guest stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Is it true? You made her sign this?" The rich man's lips parted, but no answer came. He opened his mouth again, fumbling for excuses, yet the weight of 100 eyes silenced him more effectively than any gag could. And there she stood, the maid he thought powerless. She had not shouted, had not begged, had not raised her hands, yet the room belonged to her. With nothing but words, she had shifted the tide. Guests, once her silent audience of mockery, were now her witnesses. They looked at her not as a servant, but as a woman who dared to reveal the truth. Her silence had turned into strength. Her voice had become power. The master's hand trembled at his side. He tried to laugh, but it came out broken, a sound no one believed. His wealth still glittered around him, yet it no longer shielded him. What good was gold when every eye saw only shame? The maid lifted her gaze, not toward him, but toward the guests, and without needing to say another word, her message was clear. You know what he truly is now. The power had shifted. No longer was he the untouchable master. No longer was she the invisible servant. The balance of the hall, the balance of the story, had turned, and deep inside, he knew it. But pride does not surrender easily, and in the next moment, as his mask begins to crack, the man will reveal just how far he is willing to go to keep his throne intact. Anger is the final refuge of a man losing control, and in that glittering hall, surrounded by the eyes of his peers, the rich man's anger boiled over. "Enough!" he roared, his voice bouncing off the marble walls. He surged forward, his hands slamming down on the table, rattling glasses and plates. "You will stop this insolence at once!" But the maid did not stop. Her voice rose above his fury, calm yet commanding, slicing through the chaos. "Clause 14, she read, her tone unwavering. The maid may be confined to her quarters for any perceived failure, without food, without pay, until the employer deems fit. Gasps filled the hall once again. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their laughter now a distant memory. His attempt to silence her had backfired. Every outburst only made her voice stronger. Every order only deepened his shame. "Quiet!" he shouted again, his face red, his hands trembling. "You dare humiliate me in my own house!" She did not look at him. Her eyes stayed on the contract, her voice flowing steadily like water over stone. Clause 15. The maid shall never question the employer's word. His judgment is law, absolute and final. The crowd turned toward him now, their expressions sharp, judgmental. The mighty host, who once controlled every whisper in this hall, now stood cornered under the weight of his own words. He tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. These are exaggerations, misinterpretations. She is twisting the meaning. But the maid's voice only grew steadier, fueled not by rage, but by resolve. Clause 16. The maid must endure verbal correction without protest. Should she resist, harsher methods may be applied. The words struck like a hammer against stone. His mask of arrogance cracked visibly. His smile faltered. His voice shook. His body stiffened with panic. "Stop reading," he barked, his voice breaking. "You will ruin everything." For the first time, his desperation showed. His pride was no longer armor. It was shrapnel cutting into him as it shattered. The maid finally lifted her gaze, her eyes locking with his for the first time that night. Calm, unyielding. "You built this contract to break spirits," she said softly. "But tonight, it breaks only yours." The hall fell utterly silent. His chest heaved, his fists clenched, but he could not move. His guests were no longer allies. They were witnesses. Witnesses to a man stripped bare by the truth he himself had written. He stammered, his voice cracking like brittle glass. You don't understand. This is how things are done. This is tradition." But no one nodded. No one agreed. The eyes around him told the truth he feared most. His excuses held no weight. His mask of authority was gone. The maid closed the contract gently, her hand firm, her voice steady. Tradition does not excuse cruelty, and silence does not mean ignorance. You believed I could not read. But tonight, everyone has read the truth of who you are. The man staggered back, his breath uneven, his once commanding figure reduced to trembling defiance. The guest's stares cut deeper than any blade. His power, his pride, had crumbled before them all. and in the center of it all stood the maid, unbroken, holding the very words he had forged into chains, and turning them into weapons of freedom. But her story was not finished, for beyond his broken mask lay her truth, a past he never imagined, and a revelation that would pierce deeper than ink on paper. The hall was suffused with a strange stillness, the kind that follows a storm. The contract lay closed in her hands, its words revealed, its chains exposed. The rich man stood frozen, the arrogance gone, replaced by a tremor of fear and disbelief. And yet, the maid was not finished. She took a step forward, letting the weight of her presence settle over the room. The chandeliers shimmered, reflecting in her eyes the fire that had been tempered by years of hardship. She spoke, and the hall leaned in to listen. "You think you know me?" she began, her voice calm, unwavering. "You see only what is in front of you. A maid, a servant, someone beneath you. But you do not know the years that brought me here." Her gaze drifted across the audience, pausing on the man who had underestimated her at every turn. "I was once a teacher. I guided children through lessons of language, literature, and life. I was respected, valued, and trusted. I had a place in the world that I loved. But life has a way of breaking even the strongest dreams." The guests shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her words pressing into their consciousness. They had laughed at her, ignored her, treated her as invisible. Now they were witnesses to a history they could not have imagined. War, poverty, loss. They stripped me of what I had. They forced me into roles I never wanted, roles meant to silence me, she continued, her voice tightening just enough to show the pain she had endured. And yet, even when my world was taken from me, I made a vow to never let anyone strip me of my dignity again. The rich man's lips parted, but no words came. His usual defenses, his rehearsed arrogance, failed him in the face of her truth. He realized that all the wealth in the world could not buy the courage she carried. She took a slow breath, her eyes sweeping the room, daring the audience to meet her gaze. Dignity is not measured by gold. It is not measured by titles, wealth, or the fear others have of you. Dignity is measured by courage, knowledge, and the refusal to bow to injustice. Her words resonated, echoing in the marble hall like a bell of reckoning. Whispers rose, not mocking, but admiring. Heads nodded subtly, and eyes that had once avoided hers now sought understanding. "You thought this contract would make me small. You thought my silence meant ignorance," she said, her voice firm, almost piercing. "But it did not. It cannot. I have read, I have learned, and I have survived. And tonight, I show you all that power is not in chains. It is in knowing when to speak." The man's face was pale, his mask of authority shattered completely. The audience, once passive observers, now saw the truth. She was not just a maid. She was a force, shaped by hardship, honed by knowledge, and armed with the courage to stand against him. Her eyes met his one final time. "This house, this wealth, these walls, they cannot define me. I define myself, and no contract, no arrogance, no mockery will ever take that away." The hall exhaled collectively, a silence that was no longer empty, but heavy with respect and awe. In that moment, the balance had shifted entirely. And with the truth laid bare, the next chapter would reveal just how far his pride could fall, and what it truly means to be humbled. The hall fell into a silence so thick it seemed to press against every shoulder, every chest. The chandeliers sparkled above, but their brilliance could not hide the tension etched on every face. The rich man, once a figure of untouchable pride, now stood motionless, his hands trembling slightly, his chest heaving with a mix of fury and fear. He had believed in his power, his wealth, his influence, his carefully constructed image. But in one night, one moment of revelation, all of it had crumbled. The guests, once dazzled by opulence, now regarded him with judgment, some with disbelief, others with open disdain. A guest in a jeweled gown shook her head quietly, murmuring to another, "How could anyone treat another human like this? He is shameless." The rich man's voice, when he tried to speak, was brittle. This isn't fair," he stammered, almost whispering to himself. "She's just a—" But he stopped mid-sentence, realizing the words sounded hollow, even in his own ears. His arrogance had been stripped away. What remained was a man exposed, powerless under the scrutiny of those he had once believed subservient. The maid, in contrast, stood tall, unbroken. Her posture was straight, her hands folded calmly in front of her, her eyes scanning the hall with quiet authority. She did not gloat, she did not jeer. She merely held herself with a dignity that no wealth could purchase, a presence that could not be diminished by mockery or scorn. Guests began to stir. Some turned to leave, their faces etched with disapproval. Others lingered, murmuring to each other, sharing glances of shock and judgment. The rich man's reputation, built over decades, was unraveling in the span of minutes. Every whisper, every glance, every small shake of the head was a nail in the coffin of his pride. He tried one last act of dominance, stepping forward with a forced smile, voice rising in a trembling attempt at control. "Everyone, calm down. It's just a misunderstanding." But his words fell flat. The power had left him. The audience had shifted allegiance in the blink of an eye, from the man of wealth to the woman who had courage enough to expose the truth. His commands no longer carried weight. His threats were empty echo, as in a hall that had learned the measure of his cruelty. The maid's gaze met his briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. She did not gloat. She did not taunt. Her quiet strength was enough. The man had learned too late that underestimating her had been his greatest mistake. One by one, the guests began to depart, their heels clicking against the marble, leaving behind only whispers and a palpable tension in the air. The rich man remained, frozen in place, staring at the woman who had turned the entire evening into a mirror, reflecting his own arrogance. And in the center of the hall, she remained tall, calm, unshaken, a beacon of resilience. The power had shifted completely. Tonight, she was no longer a servant in the shadows. Tonight, she was the measure of dignity, courage, and strength. And as the doors closed behind the last departing guest, the stage was set for the final chapter, where lessons would be learned and true resolution would unfold. The hall was empty now, except for the lingering echoes of what had just transpired. The chandeliers cast long shadows across the marble floor, reflecting a silence heavier than any applause. The rich man stood near the center, still reeling from the night's revelations, while the maid gathered the contract in her hands with quiet precision. She looked around one last time, her eyes tracing the grandeur that had once defined power in this house. But now, those same walls bore witness, not to wealth, but to truth. Every gilded frame, every polished surface, had silently watched as arrogance crumbled and dignity rose. "This contract," she said softly, almost to herself, "was meant to bind me, to make me small, to silence what is human in me." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like incense smoke. "But the ink that binds can also illuminate. It can reveal what is hidden. And tonight, it revealed everything." The man remained silent, too humbled or too defeated to argue. His shoulders slumped, the weight of the evening pressing down on him. For the first time in years, His authority felt fragile. The guest's departure had left him alone with the truth he had ignored, the truth that a single woman, armed with knowledge and courage, could turn a kingdom of pride into a house of reckoning. The maid stepped toward the door. Each movement was deliberate, a testament to a strength forged in years of hardship. She had walked through fear, endured injustice, and emerged unbroken. And now, she walked not as a servant bound by ink, but as a symbol of something far greater: dignity, courage, and the unassailable power of truth. Her voice, soft but carrying conviction, filled the empty hall one last time. "Never underestimate the quiet ones," she said. "Never mistake silence for weakness. Knowledge, patience, and courage, these are stronger than any wealth, any contract, any chains." The contract rested under her arm, no longer a symbol of oppression, but a reminder of victory. She did not burn it, nor shred it. The words would remain, a testament that even the most meticulously crafted chains can be unraveled when the human spirit refuses to bend. The rich man watched her leave, his face a mixture of shame and awe. He realized that the night had rewritten more than a contract. It had rewritten his understanding of power. It was no longer measured in opulence, titles, or fear. Power was in the resolve, in the courage to confront injustice, in the refusal to be diminished. She opened the massive doors, stepping into the night. The air outside was cool and liberating, carrying with it the promise of a future not dictated by someone else's ink. The moonlight traced her figure, a silent witness to the triumph of a woman who had been underestimated, ignored, and dismissed, but had risen nonetheless. And as her steps faded into the distance, the lesson lingered in the marble halls and the hearts of all who had seen Concert. Tracts can bind bodies, but truth frees souls. Arrogance can command attention, but courage commands respect. And quiet eyes, when they choose to see and act, can change everything. The night had closed, but the story remained, a tale written not only in ink, but in the courage and dignity of a woman who refused to be silenced. And somewhere beyond the mansion walls, she carried that lesson into the world, leaving behind a legacy far greater than any contract could ever contain.